Now, let us turn our attention to one of the most important employee representation protections that may arise during workplace investigations: Weingarten Rights. When an organization conducts an investigation that may lead to disciplinary action, the goal is not only to gather accurate information but also to ensure that the process is fair and that employees are able to exercise their legal rights. Weingarten Rights originate from the 1975 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in NLRB v. J. Weingarten, Inc. These rights establish that unionized employees have the right to request the presence of a union representative during certain investigative interviews. The underlying principle is that an employee should not be placed in a potentially disciplinary interview without the ability to receive support and assistance from a representative. The presence of a representative helps promote fairness, protects the integrity of the process, and provides confidence that the employee's responses are being provided voluntarily. However, it is important to understand that Weingarten Rights do not apply to every workplace conversation. The key question is whether the employee has a reasonable belief that the interview could result in disciplinary action. For example, a routine performance discussion, a general workplace conversation, or a simple fact-gathering discussion may not trigger these rights. However, if an employee reasonably believes that the meeting could result in consequences such as a warning, suspension, or termination, the right to request representation may apply. Another important feature of Weingarten Rights is that the employee must generally make the request for representation. The employer is not normally required to proactively advise the employee of this right before beginning the interview. If the employee does not request representation, the interview may proceed. However, once an employee makes a valid request, the employer must respect that request. The employer generally has three options. The first option is to grant the request and postpone the interview until a representative is available. The second option is to discontinue the interview and continue the investigation using other available evidence. The third option is to provide the employee with the choice of continuing without representation or ending the interview. What the employer cannot do is ignore the request and continue questioning the employee as though the request was never made. It is also important to understand the role of the representative during the interview. The representative is there to support the employee and help ensure that the process remains fair. The representative may provide advice, help the employee understand the process, and request clarification where appropriate. However, the representative does not replace the employee in answering questions. They cannot answer questions on behalf of the employee, coach responses, interrupt the investigation process, or turn the interview into an argument with the investigator. The employee remains responsible for providing their own account of events. The representative's role is to support the employee while allowing the investigator to complete the fact-finding process. A representative may normally consult privately with the employee before or during the interview and may request a short break when appropriate. These consultations should support the process rather than interfere with it. Investigators should also understand that Weingarten Rights are primarily a U.S. labor law concept connected with unionized workplaces. Their application may vary significantly depending on jurisdiction. In some regions, including Canada, similar representation rights may arise through collective agreements, labor legislation, or arbitration principles rather than directly through Weingarten. In non-union environments, there may not be a legal requirement to provide a representative. However, some organizations choose to allow a support person or colleague to attend interviews as a matter of good practice. This approach can reduce employee anxiety, improve cooperation, and strengthen the perception that the investigation is being conducted fairly. Failing to respect applicable representation rights can create significant problems for an organization. It may result in labor complaints, challenges to the fairness of the investigation, difficulties relying on statements obtained during the interview, or broader concerns about whether the investigation process was conducted properly. The key lesson for investigators is that effective workplace investigations require more than simply obtaining information. They require obtaining information through a process that respects employee rights and maintains procedural fairness. Respecting representation rights does not weaken an investigation. In fact, it strengthens the credibility of the process by demonstrating that the organization is committed to fairness, neutrality, and reliable fact-finding.